Recording and just do an introduction when you tell me we're ready.
Yes, we're ready.
Well, with that, thank you so much for joining us. This is Andrew Williams Jr., and this is another conversation with Andrew Williams Jr., and today with Michael AHIABGA-Harris, and we have a special guest, Don Ott. We're in a very special period of time. We're celebrating the International Underground Railroad, this being October 27th. We just completed September as the International Underground Railroad Month. However, we're looking forward to this being the beginning of the next year, which will also bookend the International Decade for People of African Descent. So Michael Harris, I really thank you so much for being able to be here with us. Now we've got your audio without your video, but we're live and streaming around the world. So tell us why we're here and what we're doing, Michael.
Well, the beautiful thing is that as the world continues to go a little haywire, and my computer starts screaming. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Okay, great. The idea that the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, it's a global construct, and here in California, our governor is in China, dealing with climate change on the planet. Our vice president is knee deep trying to figure out a way to solve something that hasn't been done in, let's just say, 1,500 years, maybe a little longer, peace in the Middle East. And we're fixated upon getting the past correct because, prior to gold coming to California, there was relatively peace here, relatively peace in the transition from Mexican rule to United States statehood. There wasn't a lot of bloodshed. They figured out how to do that. And so in the midst of that, there were thousands. And as we dig into this work, we find that there's more. There were thousands of people of African descent in this transition from slavery to freedom, self-emancipated in many instances, and others were aided along the way by abolitionists and other factors that were going around the world. So this notion of International Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, it's not new. It's going on officially about 25 years with legislation that was done by the United States Congress, and the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom had many stations officially documented here in California, and there was strong, very strong support from multiple levels of government. And I was able to attend one of the meetings in the state library's office, and ironically, folks weren't happy that I was there. Some of it, well, he can't be here. Who is he? Because 25 years ago, some people didn't know who I was and wondering why I was there. But some of the leadership, particularly Assemblywoman Cheryl Brown and Senator Teresa Hughes, oh, that young boy, he's okay. He does good work. He's fine. Let him in here. Let him stay. So, and then, we fast forward to today, people wonder, how do I have images and know what happened in that? I was like, well, I was there. And the national, I don't know the proper title, trying to turn this phone off because it's not gonna stop vibrating. The national, and Dan, you have to correct me on the name because I'm drawing a blank right now. She just retired after, I don't know, almost 30 years of service.
Diane Miller.
Yeah.
Diane Miller was the longtime nationwide program coordinator for the Network to Freedom. She was working on the project even before Congress passed the legislation in 1998.
Yeah, that's so well over 30 years. And maybe 3 months ago she retired, if that.
Mhm.
Yeah. So the beauty is that there have been strong advocates to tell the freedom story out west. And I don't know if he was the first, but he was the first one I remember. His name was Guy Washington, and he had the position that Dan is slowly evolving into. But I mean, he did a lot of work, seen and unseen ways, as a federal, any kind of federal employee. There's things you can and you cannot do, and there's things on the record, there's things off the record. And as you're creating something out of nothing, something new, you can't always, you have to follow the spirit of the law, not necessarily the law, because there is no law. There is no, they're working out administrative details. And when you start talking about people of African descent and you start working out details, I mean, we have challenges. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of give a kind of an overview on the work that has been done and what we're trying to do. And then we'll just, Dan is here, and he has, I say, a 35,000-foot elevation view of it, not just, he knows what he's doing. And we've talked, and I think we have the perfect person to pick up the reins, because Guy has been retired for well over a decade. Yeah. And so the ball has been sitting there on the ground through the Obama administration, through the Trump administration, and now with the Biden administration, there's finally some traction to revive telling the story of people of African descent that were emancipated before, during, and after the United States Civil War. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the time frame 1840 to 1875 is the interpretive period that we are dealing with. And 1840 is roughly the time where you have, solid records of people of African descent that are a part of the Western movement. We're no longer in the Spanish colonial period. We're in Mexico territory, although it is not well populated by Mexicans. It's primarily indigenous cultures that are being, for the most part, left alone, because most of the folks here are looking for, I call it, they're looking for coats. They're snatching off the pelts, the fur, they're trappers, and they're not really looking to settle. They're just on their way, migrating throughout the region. The Russian American Fur Company, various Canadian, French, and Furrier company employees, and they didn't really care who or what you were. Can you bring us some furs? And so there were a lot of people of African descent in that. And then you have the other wave, which were in the ocean. You have folks that were chasing down the whales, and they were, I call them the Boston Whalers. Everybody know about Bob Marley and the Whalers. Well, there were quite a few of them, and roughly 20 to 30%, depending on the year, were people of African descent that was on those whales chasing the oil and the bones, from the whale. And the whale, these folks were from the Eastern Seaboard, primarily around Boston, but they were in Hawaii. They were chasing the whales. Whales migrate, and they were the headquartered in Hawaii. And so you had King Kamehameha III You had the Sitka, Alaska. You had the Russian Tsarist company, the Russian American Fur Company. That's where they were based, and they were chasing the seals, big giant seals, big giant otters along the Pacific coast and up into where I live in the Folsom area. At that time, it was American River. So the idea that in all of these things, the fur trade and the whale trade, you had people of African descent in those industries, and some of them, not many of them, but most of them stayed in business because they were making money and they were free. There was a whole nother measure of freedom for people that had skills on the ocean and trapping animals out in the wild. And their foremen, their bosses, their owners in some instances valued them because they were very productive in bringing in extensive wealth. I'm talking about extensive wealth. The Russian American Fur Company, quiet as it kept, is still one of the wealthiest companies around. And of course, the American furriers, they were just ridiculously wealthy, and then transitioned that into other industries. So in this, we have the documentation of the ship manifest. We have the documentation of those that were on trails, Lewis and Clark. We always get the names of the leaders and those that were of great importance. But then there's snippets of, John had a servant, and you don't really hear much about the servant until there's an episode, and then he has a name because he saved somebody's life or he pulled somebody out of the snow, and then there's almost a paragraph on him in those instances. And so that was something that was compiled by Guy Washington, and there's several pages, several hundred pages in that document. And then there's others by the name of Delilah Beasley. I call it the Gold Book, and eyewitness accounts of people of African descent, Negro pioneers. And so we have these wonderful, I say, big loaves of bread to follow this trail. They're not breadcrumbs, they're giant loaves of bread, full of many firsthand accounts of people of African descent that were here during the transition from Mexican rule to American rule. And then on the Mexican side, we have the leadership of Mexico is President President Vicente Guerrero, who helped free Mexico from Spanish colonialism and authors the Constitution, early Constitution for Mexico. And he wasn't there by himself. There was quite a bit of slavery in Mexico, and one of the first acts as president, he was general as president. I think it was second or third general that became president of Mexico. He ended slavery in Mexico. So you have this freedom in Mexican Alta California, that is called. And it's not just the state of California it is today. Alta California, 1/3 of the Mexican territory, and it encompasses Nevada, Utah, Colorado, little bit pieces of Texas, New Mexico. All of that was Alta California. And if you go back to 1535, that was when Spanish first began the colonization of that area, Alta California, with Hernan Cortez, and he had about 300 indentured servants, conscripted slaves. Depending on your job, you were, a slave. But if you were charting the stars and you had significant skill set, you had a greater measure of freedom. And so these people of African descent that had, I guess you would say, found a way to, amalgamate into the Mexican society. Some of them, again, were presidents. Some of them, Pio Pico was the governor of California during the transition, and there were landowners with very large Mexican land grants that were people of African descent. And so these men, vast majority of them lost their land when the transition from Mexican rule to United States rule, but they were free men. And so when people were self-emancipating from bondage in the South, and those that were had a marginal quasi-freedom, they were runaway enslaved Africans on the Eastern Seaboard. Come 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Act was a part of the compromise in 1850, they were in, I guess you would say, environmental hazardous conditions of being taken back into slavery. And a lot of them came out west in the idea that they would be in Mexico and they would be free. But then the beauty and the curse of California was that there was plenty of gold in their hills, and when the gold rush hit, people from all over the world came here. And to your proximity to California, if you were furrier and you were in Utah, you got here early. If you were out on a ship in Hawaii or up in Alaska or down in Mexico and Acapulco, you got here early. So the early pioneers of African descent that were throughout the gold rush era, there's about 50 sites that were documented by a man named Joe Moore, and throughout, the entire gold mining district, there's gold mining camps. And some of those camps are still active cities today. I live in one. Negro Bar today is the city of Folsom. Negro Hill, though it's underwater, some of the area is still above water, the region, and that is El Dorado Hills. If you go up to a place called Grass Valley, there were people of African descent, quite a few. We have the document. They're sharing the documents up in Grass Valley, Nevada City. There's still cities today because the gold rush brought folks there. And once the gold left, they said, well, wait a minute, this is a beautiful area. And they became farmers. And so all of the foothills throughout the Gold Rush district, are beautiful areas that lend themselves to winemaking, wheat. Down in Yosemite, it's a national park. Down further south, Sequoia, it's a national park. Up Northern California, we have Mount Shasta and Lassen. All of these parks, all these areas, Beckworth Park, have a wonderful history. Today we call it agro-tourism, but these sites that had a significant presence of people of African descent, not just one or two, as some would like you to believe, they were magnets during the gold rush era for people from all around the world to come. So we have the documentation, for example, William Alexander Leidesdorff, who was the first elected treasurer of San Francisco. His birthday was just earlier this week, the 23rd. He was born in St. Croix. He's the first U.S. diplomat of African descent in U.S. history. His records are, I mean, they're just all over the place. But even his history is challenged. His farm that he had, where I live, 35,521 acres. His farmhouse and all of the agricultural components on the land is well documented in the lawsuit to, adjudicate his vast wealth. He built the port of San Francisco, built the first public school in California. His steamship is on the California State Seal. And, 175 years later, there's still folks want to reinterpret, reimagine, revisit, the salient contributions of people of African descent. So the last thing I'll say is the program for the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, there's, I won't say a ton, there is a lot more resources available to talk about how we get people out into nature, how we preserve nature, how we mitigate climate change. And part of that is allowing people to have a greater respect for the outdoors and the significant historical contributions that people of African descent have always had for Mother Nature. And here in California, the story, in other parts of the United States, the story has been under attack because of the nomenclature of the 1800s. Some people find the words that people of African descent, it's those that were escaping slavery, those that were trying to be human beings, they would rather just talk about folks who were slaves than talk about the people that actually built towns and had settlements and were contributing to the forward flow of humanity. That's too egregious to talk about. So we'll just erase all of that history, entire towns, all throughout California, all up and down the Central Valley. We'll erase all of those towns because the name of people of African descent in Mexico was Negro. And so, some folks don't want to be Negro in the 19th century. They prefer to be chattel slaves in the 19th century and completely erase those freedom seekers from the history book. And the final thing before I open it up is, and this is something where I'm just diving down into it because there's only so many hours a day. But one of my really good teachers, and the more I learn, the more I really have more respect for Harry Jones. He was a assistant curator at the African American Museum for Civil War in Washington, D.C. And the museum has been shut down. They're doing remodel. They're expanding it. But it's almost criminal that I didn't take better notes when he was alive. But there's quite a few documents about him online. But there's 1,918 U.S. colored troops that fought in the Civil War, and their service records say that they enlisted in California. So, that just changes the whole dynamic of talking about, a Juneteenth celebration, talking about Underground Railroad. Because if you found your way to freedom, and then in 1863, January 1st, when President Abraham Lincoln issued a presidential, what are they called? Executive order that we call the Emancipation Proclamation. And that allows people of African descent to join the Army, and they're called U.S. colored troops. You know, just south of 200,000 fought in the war, roughly 10% of the Army and about 20% of the Navy, people of African descent, but almost 2,000 came from California. So it begs the question, where did they come from? And because they have service records, it's pretty, I'm not gonna say it's easy, it's easier because the federal government paid them, and some of them were given the opportunity to join the regular Army after the Civil War, and they became Buffalo Soldiers. So there's a window there that hasn't been very well explored. I can't find it. And so there's an opportunity there to really dive down there where we have solid records, government records. And I'm certain that those men of valor and, you know, skills have members of their family that are still living. So let me think, did I miss anything? Oh, so the Underground Railroad, although September is the month, and there was a whole gamut of new sites that were designated as officially part of Underground Railroad Network Freedom. It's not, we don't wait till next year. We start now, and it's a year-round process. We begin to teach, and that's where Dan will come in. We'll be able to teach and find resources of how, say if you have a church, your AME church in Chico, California, and you have some members that you know who they were. There's a definitive oral tradition, and then there's records that show that yes, we are part of Underground Railroad to Freedom. Okay, so now what do you do, and how do you document that, and how do you get officially on the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom? It seems like it's an arduous process, but when we do this together, it won't be so bad. And then if we raise a pot of money, and then we share that pot of money in a good way. I think Andrew, his team down in LA, the money that's down in LA, they used to telling stories in LA, Hollywood, they tell stories all the time. Some true, some not true. But the beauty is the political will right now, while everybody's focused on reparations, we can finally tell an authentic story of what actually happened in California. Because reparations, that may take another 150 years. It took us a long time just to get to Juneteenth. I was on that team. It took 30 years. The modern Juneteenth movement, I don't have the patience and energy to get into that. But for Juneteenth and the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, I'm all in. So I'm glad we're here. Glad Andrew agreed to tape this. And this, if nothing else, what we'll do today is spark conversations. And then I threw a lot out there, and I purposely put the T-ball up in some places, and a couple places I threw a curveball at you. But whatever you have to, I'm glad you're here, and I look forward to working with you as 2024 quickly gets here.
Sure. Michael, I enjoyed listening. I think listening is a big part of my job, and just sort of making sure I get a better understanding of what folks are interested in, right?
But Dan, first for our audience, please take time to introduce not just yourself, but the fact that you're with the National Park Service, and I'm on their website now, and there is something called the Journey to Freedom, and it is in fact my visit last about a few months ago to the Boston area, where I was introduced to Reginald Tiller. I'm going to connect you guys together, because the whole idea is that there is a continuum of this Underground Railroad that's not just here in California, but actually it looks like this. And so it's the National Park Service, as I understand it, that is responsible for making sure all these heritage sites are honored and protected. So Dan, please start with introducing of yourself.
Oh, sure. Sorry, Andrew. It was unclear to me that this was a kind of like a webinar podcast kind of thing. I thought it was more of like a discussion among the key stakeholders. So I was a little bit.
It is.
I'm a little confused about the format.
It's global. We're personal, but we're global.
That's okay. No, so the Network to Freedom program is created in 1998 to the public. I mean, what I always say is we commemorate, preserve, and interpret the history of resistance to slavery through escape and flight. And we do that by administering a network of sites across the country that have documented history associated with that those freedom seeking stories. Because through a study process, Congress said there is not one place that embodies that history. It is a national story. And so we need to come up with a different kind of park unit to tell and commemorate that story. And so we have today, 25 years later, 767 sites that are in the Network to Freedom.
Wow.
Which is big history, right? And so that's essentially, what my job is I am the person who's responsible for the Western United States. Michael got this on the head. The last time someone was responsible for the Western United States was Guy Washington 10 years ago. In my region, we've got 17 Network to Freedom sites total. And I think that if you look at a map of where all of our sites are, which you can see, you'll see that there's a real heavy upper Midwest bias, real heavy East Coast bias, because people think Network to Freedom is Quakers with hidey holes and Harriet Tubman, and that's it, right? And we try to tell a bigger story and a more holistic story. And I think that when I'm thinking about, when I just listening to Michael, you sort of say, I'm thinking and I'm one part of what Michael sees as a much larger story about the Black West that isn't just about slavery, it's about agency, right? It's about building towns, building lives, not just about being enslaved folks, but, agents of their own, of themselves, agents of national history, of international history in a borderland area like California, which is super cool to just listen to and think about and reflect about in terms of the big picture stuff. And so when I talk to Michael and I listen to Michael talk about these things, I see in what he knows and can recognize in sort of his font of experience. Because as Michael probably knows, and you probably know, Andrew, history is cumulative. You can only gain a knowledge of history through lots of exposure and lots of hearing lots of stories and consuming lots of stories. There's not anything intuitive about understanding history like math or physics. So people who know, I don't know that much about California freedom seeking stories. I don't. I know a lot about the Civil War. I know a lot about the Upper Midwest. I know a lot about public history. I don't know as much as someone like Michael knows about that place. I do know a lot about my federal program though. And so where my federal program sort of comes in here is when we think about places associated with the history of freedom seeking in California, we want to ask questions like, do we have a place that we can say we can document the past that happened here? And then once we have that ability to say we can document the past that happened here, we can write a story about it and we can put in footnotes and we can do that kind of academic scholarly work. We then also ask the follow-up question, which is, do we have a property owner who would consent to having that story recognized within the National Park Service Network to Freedom? And so there's a process that goes along with that, but really listening to Michael talk about all that stuff, I think hey, where are the places where we can start picking up the work that Joe Moore did previously, picking up the work that Guy Washington did previously, picking up the work that Michael Harris is doing presently, in the future, and in the past. Where's the things that we can do? What are the things that we can do? We can sort of, stick a pin in it and say, let's do this. Let's find this spot. Let's find that spot. Let's then get resources around those. Because that's the thing about our program, is that our program isn't just sort of a standalone commemorative program. We then try to empower our commemorative sites, our associated sites, by offering technical assistance, by offering collaborative opportunities, and by administering a grant program that helps them to tell those stories. And so that's essentially, what the program is like it's a collaborative network of sites, programs, and facilities that are associated with telling the story of freedom seeking. And then we try to create opportunities to empower those affiliates to continue doing that work, which Congress has deemed nationally significant for quite a while now.
Wonderful. I would like to also ask both of you to take a page out of Donald Trump's book. And that page is not to spend money on advertising, spend more time on doing those stories that get attention, that can be publicized, and take advantage of public relations, as opposed to spending money on advertising to reach eyes. Specifically, I want to let you know that what both of you are doing is part of the American fabric. And it's not just Black history, it's not just American history, it's world history. But everything you've talked about now, let's say all those sites that you are representing across the United States, Dan, they're also connected to a network in Canada, because eventually, and Mexico for that matter, because people went north and south. But for here in California, and it's so important what Michael brings to the table, is this opportunity for us to engage the National Park Service, I believe, Dan, with telling those stories of each of those separate places around the country as part of our cultural tourism effort going forward. Again, next year is the end of the International Decade for People of African Descent, but 2026 is a milestone for America. So on this site, America250.org, join all Americans, share your story about your history, your hopes, your dreams for the future of our country. Together, we will tell the American story through videos and the most inclusive commemoration in our history. I say that to say, Dan, that right now, every person that you know that has a mobile phone, they have an ability to become a producer as well as a consumer. And it's critically important that those people that travel and visit these locations on that site, they start tweeting about what they're doing. They start letting other people know about, this is wonderful, this is wonderful. But again, there has to, I think, be a cohesiveness in what we're doing. So I'm going to take the radical step, Dan and Michael, and ask you both to think about what we're doing as part of a docu-reality series. And the great news is that as we document it, we can always go into post-production and make it pretty, and appeals and bells and whistles. But when you say, Dan, that you have resources to help technical expertise with these various places and sites, and ways to help them to promote their activities, I'm suggesting we have a team right here on this Zoom, this little small group that can help empower all of them. Because the first thing is to create the documentation, but think how important it would be for our children to be the ones to carry the stories to their friends and families. We're all on this phone, we're over 18. Everyone under 18 is what we're doing all this for. The more we can engage them, I think the more powerful and impactful what we're doing can have a longer lasting effect than just our own lifetimes. I'll put a pin in it there for any thoughts or ideas. And if none, I'll wrap it up.
No, I sort of just generally think that it's just a really cool, what I get the opportunity to do is to connect with people who are passionate about sharing this history, and I get to empower them to do things. And I think a major part of that, as I used to be a history professor, I used to be a classroom educator for museum in Minnesota, is creating opportunities to spark revelation about the present through understanding the past, right? Is that what we do as historians, what we do as public historians, is create opportunities to provoke people's ethical imaginations to understand other people's experiences other than ourselves, through exposing them to a diversity of real histories. And I think that that's really important work. And I think that that's important work, especially for connecting with kids. And so I think those opportunities are important. And I think the National Park Service, is interested in creating those opportunities as well as in manifesting those opportunities and supporting those opportunities. So I know that you sort of said a lot of things there, Andrew, and that's just responding to one of the variety of things. But yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there because I think it's neat and it's cool stuff to find folks who want to do the work and support them doing it. So
Michael, this is your segment, Michael. So we can wrap it up. You can take us in another direction, or Dan, you can talk more, or we can follow up afterwards. But Michael Kubiaka-Harris, the ball's in your court. And of course, your screen is frozen, but hopefully your audio will still let you connect with us. Technology is only great when it works.
Right. I think a lot of people have discovered that recently. Yeah.
Well, the great news, Michael, is that I'm going to give you an opportunity to have any closing thoughts, because today we've been discussing this international network of the International Underground Railroad Network, dealing with the California Gold Rush era. And you did specifically mention that. I will share my screen here. I believe I brought up the link, Michael, that you had actually done earlier this year. So let me stop sharing here and start sharing over. Oh, Michael, are you there? You waving? But can you talk so that we can hear you? No, it doesn't look as though. Yeah, it looks as though your mic is open. We don't hear you. Your mic is open, but we don't hear you. There you go. I think we can hear you now. At least your mic shows that it's open. Both mics are open and no sound. Mike, your mic's not miking. Well, anyway, I'm gonna do this until we stop. Earlier this year, Michael actually helped to participate in the launch of the announcement here. This is Central Valley, 2023 California Missions Day, the rebirth of our Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. And Michael, whenever your audio comes in, just talk over me and I know you're there. But this happened earlier this year. Oh, let me see. I've got a lot of things on my screen. September the 9th. And this was in Leidesdorff Plaza in historic Folsom Station in Folsom, California. And I know this is too small for you to read. And I'm just going to spend time reading this until Michael comes back online. But this says California Emissions Day is September 9th, 1850, and remains the essential part of our 1850 compromise. Historic Negro Bar, gold mining town established in 1849, remains a hub for an unsurpassed golden legacy poised for a rebirth. 2023 International Underground Railroad Month. The fiercely debated U.S. Congressional Act was signed by President William Willard Fillmore. It strengthened and extended slavery throughout the vast Utah and New Mexico territories. Passage of the Fugitive Slave Law made federal government finally responsible for capturing and returning freedom seekers to their enslavers as property owners. As more people today learn about International Underground Railroad Month, they often learn about a very secret, regimented movement for freedom taking place from 1830 to 1860. September 2023, we learn that white abolitionist allies who helped usher freedom seekers from one location to another until they reach freedom, the history of the Underground Railroad is very complex, especially when we include the transition from Mexican rule to US rule throughout Alta California. The Underground Railroad would not have existed without the brave men and women who made the decision to exercise their autonomy, escape from their enslavers, and claim their own personal freedom. Freedom seekers traveled in whatever direction necessary to find a destination where they could live freely. Our California Gold Rush era from 1840 to 1875 is an amazing time to consider. As long as people enslaved others, freedom seekers escaped to build a better lives for themselves and, if possible, their families. The towns Negro Hill, Mormon Island, and Negro Bar showcase a hub of activity throughout the gold mining district along the American River Basin. Wherever and whenever slavery existed, there were efforts to escape. Free Black communities and many indigenous tribes came together to aid freedom seekers in their fight for freedom, not just Quakers and wealthy white abolitionists. Preserving historic Negro Bar and the 20+ year work showcasing California pioneers of Pan-African ancestry from 1840 to 1875 helps us to understand the Underground Railroad as one of the first international civil rights movements. The United States codified the ability of enslavers to capture freedom seekers, and the state of California followed with the California Fugitive Slaver Law in 1852. This is very evident reviewing the U.S. Constitution's Fugitive Slave Clause, as well as the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793. These laws were strengthened after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which made the federal government responsible for capturing and returning freedom seekers to their enslavers. Federal marshals could capture freedom seekers in any state, regardless of state laws. Private citizens could be deputized on the spot to assist in capturing freedom seekers, and failure to do so could result in a 6-month prison sentence or $1,000 fine. After extensive international legal battles, nations such as Canada created laws that did not allow for Americans to extradite freedom seekers after they crossed the international boundary. With seen and unseen supporters, the International Underground Railroad made more difficult for enslavers not only to locate freedom seekers, but to force them back into a life of enslavement. Throughout the California gold mining district, freedom seekers continued to face challenges, and today, preparing for the 174th anniversary of Negro Hill, Mormon Island, and Negro Bar, the legacy of freedom seekers continues to combat racism, disparaging treatment, while fighting for inclusion and equality. Our California Gold Rush era remains an unsurpassed celebration of freedom, while many grieved their family members who were sold away or chose not to escape. Many constructed new lives for themselves, despite dangers of being kidnapped and sold by slave catchers after they immigrated. As in many parts of the United States, the resilience of those who escaped slavery continues to serve as inspirations for countless individuals. The National Park Service's National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program, established in 1998, serves to document and share California Underground Railroad histories, headquartered here along the American River Basin. And I'm going to end this just by clicking on this link that I hope you can see takes us right back to the International Underground Railroad Month. On the right, Dan, can you see my screen? Did it change over? Yeah,
Yep.
To the right, you'll see, as Michael earlier indicated, and Dan stated very clearly, the majority of those arrows and squiggles on the right-hand side deal with what's happening and what most people are aware of, But on the left-hand side, you'll see that from California, the flow went north and south from up to Canada and down to Mexico. This is a map that it took me a long time to find, and so it's not very easily findable, but I encourage all of you to do your history, do your research, and give special attention to the work of the National Park Service, because this is our federal dollars at play to establish this part of our American history. So thank you all for joining us. Michael Kriapka is gone. Dan Ott, you're here. So this has been another conversation with Andrew Williams Jr. And today's topic was the International Underground Railroad Network. So thank you so much, everyone. And we're going to have a fantastic day. Any closing thoughts for you, Dan?
No, thank you so much. I appreciate it,
wonderful.
Andrew.
We're out.
Yep.